is to hold your silence. So when you roll out a national strategy, which part of that strategy needs to be in a closet amongst those who are efficient and able to leverage it geopolitically? Which parts of those engagements are just playing to the gallery, very vocal, very loud? Which parts of the game and narrative are created so that attention can be diverted? Which parts of the game are played so that you can usurp resources and control strategic technology? I think those are the conversations that need to be had. For too long, when we look at ourselves, and Mr. Sood has been kind enough to indulge in a certain degree of pragmatism with a young colleague like me. For years, we've had this understanding between us that we both have a habit of speaking truth to power, but also to each other. I disagree when we say in this book that the West is on a path of decline. I do so pragmatically because today we are building our systems on technologies. Who owns that technology? Who owns that enterprise software? So truly, there has been a past where economic subjugation means colonizing. Truly, there has been a past where cultural subjugation is by erasing a part of your history. But what is now relevant is to recognize that we have had a geopolitical shift from economic nationalism to digital nationalism. And a part of it is also the cultural appropriation or strategies that you spoke of. Mr. Sanyan made a reference to the Arab Spring. If you look at the roots of that so-called revolution, it did not spring from a desire to turn a whole system around based on the tenets of democracy. It was actually based on a fight between a street vendor and a municipal administrative staff in a marketplace. That's how traders in a marketplace united against an administrative officer, and it became slowly converted into a national movement. That is the power of narratives. That for if such a spring was only reduced to a fight between a street vendor and an officer, it would not have ignited the imagination of people across the world. So, if we talk about genuine power games, the first rule of that power game is to not celebrate somebody's decline, but to learn from it. It is not to be gregarious about your expected ascent. It is to pause at that crossroad of history and say, how can I learn from their follies, my mistakes of the past, and create a formidable future? So if you look at the China plan now for 2030, one of the very curious pronouncements is how China will engage culturally around the world, which for some may flummox them, because you may have thought that that country is on a path of digital supremacy. That while everybody is talking about semiconductors in India, they are talking about building a 3-nanometer chip. They are going to put in $70 billion only to build their data centers, knowing well that today the West, when speaking of data centers, is confronted with the reality of shortage of water resources and electricity. They are learning from the mistakes of the West and course correcting every single day. It is not a month or half a quarter in reflection. It is regenerating your resources, reallocating your strategies to build every single day. They pronounced a strategy of Make in China. They fulfilled those ambitions. Now they are pronouncing that in the next 5 years, they will have a cultural imprint across the world. So if you look at the Red Book, that is what was quintessentially spoken of.
There are a few Red Books.
Well, ours is in the trash can for some, but I'm of the opinion, I will not quote as Mr. Panda did, very efficiently. I will look closer to the Godfather, given that I'm sitting next to the master spy. Like, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. So I would even read from them. And there is no harm in being practical enough to do that. So why is it that in an era where there are tariff wars, does one of your neighbors pronounce a part of their strategies to be culturally appropriating a part of the globe? What is TikTok all about? That is just another manifestation of a greater plan. So while yes, we are one of the largest consumption markets in the world, can that be our only strength? Can that be the only leverage? That is a question I think Mr. Sood's book also helps us understand. So yes, I was there, book 1, book 2, book 3. That's because when he even spoke about the power of narrative being the ultimate goal. What is the narrative that we are creating today? You spoke about, and the book writes about, media from a perspective of politics and military strategy. But if you look at the US, how did they create this impossible picture that they will rescue every American who's distraught? They didn't do it through their normal mediums of newspapers, news channels, radio. They did it through film and craft. They did not do it loudly, they did it subtly. And they made it an ambition for everybody to aspire to that benchmark. So when they are setting the standards and they are setting the benchmarks and they are setting the ambitions, are you running their race? Or are you creating a new platform to compete?
Now let me ask you 2 short questions. Number 1, your own personal story. And I think it's a very important narrative story. And I've seen some of it personally. If I remember, it was Hamid Karzai who came to Raisina many years ago and said that there were no terrorist attacks in Afghanistan when Kyoki Saas Bhi Kabhi Bahu was running on television. Everyone was watching the serial. He said this in one of the interactions in Raisina many years ago. I remember. The second, of course, was you had led a delegation for the Hajj pilgrimage, and at least more recently as minority affairs minister. And when I was in Saudi Arabia around that time, I was told you were literally mocked in that place, which where people gather for a very particular purpose. But you had a huge reception when you were leading a delegation in India for a particular purpose. Isn't that in many ways the power of creating a visual imagination of it?
I think that the fact that I was somebody who is not only a practicing Hindu, but also somebody who did not have a headscarf.
Yeah, correct.
That in itself was a realization that my state can exist in its cultural form with me as a representative without me fitting into a silo that they described apt for me. I went there as a representative, as a minister of my country. There were formulations which were at play where many before me had gone. But how do I, without offending their sensitivities, say India shall position itself on a particular issue of exchange of people without subjugating itself to your norms and stand as equal? So the fact that my gender, the fact that my religion, the fact that I went without a headscarf made me an outlier, did not create a rampage there. In fact, was acceptable. So how much of us, in terms of narrative building, is being built in the shadow of what we expect is acceptable? And how much of that envelope is being pushed by us, irrespective of the norms already set? Now that being said, the book also mentions the capacity of narratives from a perspective of NGOs and indices. I served as Minister Gender as well. And one of the first issues that we took up was the issue of the Global Hunger Index and the Gender Index, which happened at the World Economic Forum. You were a witness to it. And instead of oscillating between screaming and shouting and playing victim, and instead of utilizing as a conspiracy theory, what we could do within our system in collaboration with our colleagues was to call out the facts that went missing. The fact that Gallup just called 2 people and asked, "Are you hungry?" The fact that the Global Gender Gap Index did not take into account 1.5 million Indian women who are voted into our panchayati system. The fact that the math in itself would have placed India right on the top. Now, those are issues which we did not limit to just conversations and proclamations. From the World Economic Forum for India, I got it in writing. The acceptance that their methodology was wrong. So I think that when you're trying to create a perception, or for that matter, fight a narrative, you have to do it, as Mr. Sood says. You know that there are coercive instruments at play. They know that you're going to be reactive. What they do not expect is you being measured. What they do not possibly expect is that every sentence is also evidence. So do you then perform your service from a position where they already have psychologically presumed you will position India's case, or do you then engage in a different fashion, for they will never find that formulation in any book as to how to engage with India?
Let me paraphrase your previous intervention, one part of it, which was on, and I'm paraphrasing, and I may be wrong, you can correct me, that perhaps we are over-evident in our assent. We perhaps have to be far more realistic in both the pace as well as the reality of the transformation that is underway. So my question to you was that there was a big famous Chinese line, hide your ambitions and bide your time. Where are we on that?
Given the advent of technology, given the fact that Mr. Sood, given his record of service, can describe in a book which is publicly available all the games that were played, how much of it is still hidden? There are men in this audience today who have served with Mr. Sood. Why? Because serving in one of the highest intelligence offices in our country. They are quiet, they are unnamed, you don't even know when to pick one of them through the strap. So the issue is, there is too much out there in the open, but the great games will be played in silence in the shadows.
This is